Okay, China said he wanted to invite a conversation, so who would like to come into the conversation?
I mean, I can just keep going if you want, but I would suggest it would be more interesting if I stopped and we had a sort of discussion about this.
I was just going to say that your point around, you know, it's a whole thing around what, you know, using your book as it's supposed to be a platform for lecturing to others, and if it is, it's not going to, you know, it's quite see-through, it's quite transparent. And you can actually lose the audience far more than engage them if you're a lot more subtle and actually sticking to the knitting about what you're trying to do, what your actual main purpose is with your literature.
I think, I mean, I can't prove this, obviously, but my suspicion is that very, very few people have ever been recruited to political positions because of fiction. Now, I'm not saying that fiction has no impact on people. I'm not, you know, I read Ursula Le Guin when I was very young, had a massive impact. You know, you read The Left Hand of Darkness, you come away with all kinds of thoughts about gender politics and so on and so forth. Of course it does. But I do think that the idea that people would be recruited to positions with fiction is not just extremely, extremely rare, but not actually desirable either. So, you know, where I would not want to go down the line is taking that and saying that therefore there is something a bit vulgar about having politics and discussions of these issues within fiction. I think, if anything, the opposite. It's kind of a political indulgence to be either evading these issues completely. You know, I mean, at the moment, if somebody writes a kind of to take an extreme example, there's a lot of Israeli novelists who write, you know, limpid, perfectly, you know, often, you know, well expressed sort of novels of sort of, you know, interpersonal relationships in, you know, between couples in Tel Aviv, for example, and that's all that happens. And there's no line in it that sort of says, you know, I support the occupation, you know. But if that's all that happens in that book, given that context at this time, that's a political intervention. And I think, you know, and it's a pretty toxic one. And I think that these things are always contextual. You know, if Israel, you know, was not an occupying nation, the same book would not have the same. It wouldn't be in the same context. It wouldn't be doing the same job. What I suspect is going to start happening with climate change is that as it becomes more and more and more of a political issue, particularly in you know the areas of the poor world that are being most obviously affected by it, the non-engagement with it at all is going to become an increasingly loud political act in a novel. And that it won't be a question of saying, you know, writers need to think about how to engage with this. It's going to become more and more of an almost kind of politically aggressive act to refuse to engage with this on some level. And I suspect that we're at the beginning of a shift at the moment.
Carol,
Yeah,
just...
I hope you won't be offended about what I'm going to say, but when you were reading, I was thinking, you know, it reminded me somehow the reading of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, given his political opinions, it might be a bit offensive. And, you know, when in the mythos he talks about things that are unpronounceable and, you know, unspeakable, the horror was unspeakable. Do you think for some writers that climate change is a sort of, you know, indescribable, horrible, unspeakable, and that's why they don't write about climate change?
Well, first of all, I don't take offence. I mean, Lovecraft is very influential on me. Plenty of the, I mean, yes, he was a bilious, horrible old fascist, but you know, I mean, he was also a writer who.
That's why I had to say that.
You know, you don't choose the writers that make a big impact on you. You have to kind of relate to the way that you relate to them, but you don't get to choose. You know, I mean, you know, he's just a huge presence for me. So, but in terms of the question of, it's a very interesting question actually. I do think there's an element to which, excuse me, the scale of this is so enormous, and also because of the fact that it is mediated through this kind of non-existent shibboleth that we've constructed in our society called nature, you know, which obviously doesn't exist in this kind of projected way. It's, you know, you know, there's never been this sharp distinction between humanity and nature, obviously. But whereas, for example, if you look at, you know, if you see footage of, you know, Gaza, or you remember footage from South Africa from, you know, the 80s or whatever, you know, or even, you know, the Occupy Wall Street, it's very clear that someone is doing a thing to someone else. You can see it. You can see it right there. The thing with climate change is you need a kind of intervening political analysis to be clear about the extent to which this is being done by someone to someone else. Because if you look at the footage, you may just see someone whose house has been washed out. You don't see someone in a uniform hitting them with a stick, you know. You don't see an industrialist reaching into their pocket and taking all their money away, or whatever it might be. And that's where, that's why, I think that's one of the reasons it's actually much easier to depoliticise the issue of climate change. And this is why I strongly suspect what we're going to get is not just a kind of wave of climate change fiction, but and not just a wave of apolitical climate change fiction, but in some respects a wave of sort of reactionarily, politically evasive fiction about that. Now, well, I couldn't possibly comment. No, I mean, truthfully, I haven't read Solar, so I can't comment. But certainly, in terms of the way McEwan depoliticised the or anti-politicised the anti-war movement in Saturday, I think that would make sense to me.
It just steers away from the issues all the time. Interesting, right?
But I do also think that it's not a writer's duty to you may not. It is not your duty as a fiction writer to be interested in politics. Now, the fact is, politics will be interested in you, whether you like it or not. Now, my own feeling about that is, therefore, you might as well be interested in it and engage with it. But if for example, in science fiction, which obviously is the field I work in, these articles started to appear about a couple of years ago. People saying, why is there no climate change fiction? And a lot of us within the genre minds were sort of like, please, we've been doing this for years, because we've been writing stories about environmental degradation and the ruination of it. But the fact is, a lot of those are, sort of, if you like, rip-roaring adventure stories. They don't engage with kind of political critique of the system that got us there. And I'm not going to, I really enjoy them. Some of them are, they're great adventure stories. Now, that doesn't preclude talking about them politically and saying, once you reach a certain critical mass, what is it that's going on if we're sort of so invested with our apocalypse that we don't want to kind of investigate how the apocalypse came up in the first place? But I would always want to kind of walk this line, and I would have to always take it on a case-by-case basis. If someone writes, a fantastically entertaining, dried up world or drowned world apocalypse that has nothing overt to do with the politics of climate change, I might really enjoy it. I might really enjoy the kind of, the vision of it. I like visions of ruined cities. But if that's all that ever happens, then there's a cultural problem as well. And it's just, it's always a sort of case-by-case thing, I think I would say. But I do like your idea about the kind of unrepresentability of it because of the scale. I think there's definitely something to that. People don't know quite how to metabolise it yet.
Most people
Brian,
sorry.
waiting patiently.
I now can't remember whether it's Hyde Cove or Cove Hyde. Which is it?
Cove Hyde.
Cove Hyde. Is it published?
It was in the Guardian website, so it's online. You can.
Right. Thanks. I very much agree with what you're saying. In that, two thoughts. I went to Greenland at the National Theatre about 6 months ago, and was very disappointed because it was so didactic. Right? I mean, it was so full of facts and figures about climate change that I found myself looking at my watch and was so relieved when a polar bear appeared, which for me was the highlight, a pretend one, obviously. Well, perhaps not, but anyway. But what was interesting to me was, as I left thinking, oh my goodness, far too didactic, a lot of the younger people in the audience were thronging at the radio in the foyer, discussing it. And so I learnt a valuable lesson, which I've learnt 1,000 times. I think we all have. Different things get to different people. So for me, as soon as I know that somebody's being didactic, it switches me off, because if I want facts, I'll go to that. I don't want that in fiction. So I agree with that. The second thing, which also picks up what you said, there's a short story, and I keep meaning to find it, never have, that I read when I was 18, which was a long, long time ago, by E.M. Foster, 1928.
The machine stopped.
Yes! You're the first person I've met who knows it! Whoa! And that affected me as an 18-year-old, and it has informed my life. Thank goodness, I didn't dream it.
I can send you a copy if you want. I've got a copy.
Yeah, brilliant.
The thing about didactic, I mean, I completely agree. I don't enjoy. There's this paradox. It's the kind of Perrettian paradox that as someone very political, I tend to not enjoy particularly politically didactic theatre or fiction or whatever. And I think your point about the way that the play was responded to is very important. But I also think, and it's uncomfortable sometimes, this, I have to be honest about that, but I think that it's important that we don't sort of elide, if you like, a kind of critical aesthetic response from a kind of contextualised social response. So in this case, it may well be that it didn't work as a play, and I think you have to be able to say, not just wasn't for me, but I thought it was a bad play. Now, I'm delighted that, people... I'm delighted that it had an impact on those... And I feel very much like this. I mean, I'm going to kind of unleash a chorus of contumely and ill feeling, I'm sure, but I feel very strongly about this recent trend for the theatricalisation of government reports. You know the way.
Oh yes.
I can't bear them. I find where you take the verbatim government report, and in most cases it is absolutely verbatim. It's just edited down, and then you perform it as a play. I find these utterly artistically barren. I find them completely tedious. And they don't interest me at all. And I find it a little bit depressing that is the way, that is what has, to me, the reduction of what the notion of political theatre can be has become. That said, I also think they are an expression of something rather exciting that's going on politically. I think they probably do impact some of the audience and the readers in a way that I would find very sort of exciting and positive and so on. And I just have to be able to ride that contradiction. I have to be able to say, not for me, but I'll be prepared to have an argument as to why I think it's bad form theatrically. But that doesn't preclude me saying I'm really, really pleased a bunch of people want to engage with ideas, and if that's the way they're going to do it, then okay. But so I would want to have my cake and eat it on that level.
Sarah. Oh, sorry, Brian.
Yeah. Just to take one climate change hypothesis, although technology plays a part, the theme that it's mankind's folly can be picked up quite easily. They made quite a mega film fairly recently, didn't they, called The Age of Stupid. And if you did read the book by Gerard Diamond, what comes through that you have civilization after civilization, just progressing on a very stupid way. And there are all sorts of psychological explanations, of which the most plausible is groupthink. Now, although it's probably not the meatiest subject for you or that appealing, would you be at all enticed with a view to demonstrating how the proclivity for folly is so deeply embedded, you want to make that point, that you take the topic of what it was like living in the last few years in Easter Island, either for a child or for an adult, where the city buggers cut down all the trees on which they so heavily depended, and then when they all got rid of them, they thought, oh dear. Now, is it possible to convey that, to put it simply, is it possible to wake up many, many people to the sheer stupidity of what they're doing via the medium of picking a scenario and illustrating how some were more stupid and some were trying to feed in some intelligence and were cut to one side? Would that be a legitimate theme for a writer to run with the covert intention of waking up people to how stupid we are?
Well, there's at least two hypotheses and questions there. There's the question of whether the drive of what is going wrong in the world is that we are stupid, whoever we are stupid on the whole, that on aggregate humanity is pretty stupid, which I don't accept, to be honest. I think it's much more a question of dynamics that which disempower people. So the tragedy is that an awful lot of the time it's not a question. I mean, obviously there are sometimes people do things that aren't in their own interest, of course, but actually a lot of the time what happens is it's a question of people you know, in many cases knowing full well there are millions of people around the world. We know that climate change is happening. We know it's a terrible thing. The question is, at the moment, we are not yet, hopefully, in a position to stop it. You know, that's what we're trying to do. You know, so I don't think it's about individual stupidity. And in fact, I think it's very much to the advantage of the people who gain from these systems to constantly insist that it is down to individual stupidity. I think that somewhat misanthropic notion of humanity cleaves against the powerless. Second, now, whether one agrees with that notion of the general stupidity of humanity or not, the second part of the question is, you know, is it possible and desirable for a writer to sort of, I think you said covertly, you know, try and persuade people to this or indeed any other position? And my argument would be no, I don't think it is. You know, now some people would disagree with me, but you know, I've said, you know, I've been asked about, you know, we've talked about this. I've talked about this for like over a decade because I've always, you know, because I've been political and I've written fiction, and I always say, you know, if I, you know, fantasy novels are very bad modes of propaganda. You know, it's not they're good at certain things, but convincing people of, you know, the advantages of socialism is not one of them. You know, so and I think any writer that sets themselves up. And I know some writers do this. I mean, Margaret Atwood, I believe, did this with Oryx and Crake. I think part of her, she said, and I've never quite known the extent to which she was playing and trying to be provocative, but she certainly claimed that part of the reason she wrote Oryx and Crake was to warn people about the dangers of genetic manipulation. Now, you may like Oryx and Crake, you may not, but I think if you judge it on the axis, did it wake the world's, you know, attention to the dangers of genetic manipulation, it's got deemed a resounding failure. So I don't think that's what fiction does, frankly. I would love it if it did. It would give me vastly more power than I think I have. But no. So I don't. Yeah, I don't think that's how you make politics work with fiction.
Can I throw just three examples coming from my side? Gulliver's Travels, 1984, and the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist.
What? These are examples of what, though?
These are examples of, in essence, an overtly political writer. But I mean, taking Gulliver's Travels, I don't think that Swift actually pushed that as a political treatise. He was trying to come up with a captivating and intriguing fairy story in which he was trying to illustrate, in essence, I think, the folly of people's attitudes at the time he was writing.
I would agree with that. I don't see that there's a disagreement between us on this. I mean, I'm not arguing for apolitical fiction. I'm certainly not arguing that writers shouldn't impregnate their fiction with their analysis of the world. I'll give you an example. The Lord of the Flies, you know, the William Goldberg. I think The Lord of the Flies is a work of staggering genius. I also think it's a nasty piece of work. I think it's a nasty piece of work, and I don't know. Sometimes nasty for me is praise. In this particular context, I think it's a book predicated on a certain kind of slanderous misanthropy about the quote human spirit. I think that notion that, you know, strip out all the niceties and we degenerate to barbarism, I think is not true and reactionary. It doesn't alter the fact that I think it's an astoundingly brilliant novel, and that part of the way I think it's so brilliant and so interesting is because I want to argue with it all the time. You know, same as I do with Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Brilliant piece of work predicated on extreme racism. You know, you can't. So, if I've given the impression that I'm saying you shouldn't have politics in fiction, I think it's both impossible to do so and not desirable. I love Swift, and Gulliver's Travels is one of my all-time favourite novels. But I don't think that Gulliver's Travels, you know, convinced vast numbers of humanity of anything in particular that had a political impact. Not on that basis. These things are just too mediated for that, I think. Similarly with 1984. 1984, I mean, not a book I like nearly as much as Swift, it has to be said, but you know, 1984 is arguably, if you're going to talk about political impact, one of the more politically impactful fiction books of the last 100 years. But what impact did it really have, politically speaking? Really, you know, what big political issues did it change? you know, people who had certain agendas used it to perpetuate the agendas they already had. I am very unconvinced that the fundamental shape of the political world was altered by the arrival or otherwise of that novel.
Well, there are certain critical concepts that are introduced into the political language. Like
Sure,
you
yeah.
speak, for example. I think that's quite an important addition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think these things have no impact, and I know but I think the impact is it's often quite atomised. It's often down to an individual, not always, but often. And B, it's so mediated by other things that that I always get antsy when people talk about novels having this kind of effect. I'll give you an example. Ursula Le Guin's books for younger readers, the Earthsea books. The narrator of the main character in the Earthsea books, in the first three at least, Ged, is a black kid, and it's mentioned in passing. She doesn't make a big thing of it, but he's described as dark skin. And she said once that, you know, she wrote, these are like, 35 years old now, something like that, and no one said anything. No one, all the cover art depicted Ged as a white kid. You know, for like 25 years, no one said anything. And then 25 years later, she started getting letters from black people now in their 30s and 40s saying, "We saw, we got it. It meant more than you know." You know. Now that's incredibly moving, and you can't possibly say that book hasn't had an impact politically on those people. But the idea that in and of itself has, you know, fundamentally shifted race relations, it's just too mediated for that. So I'm always trying to kind of walk this line. I'm not saying fiction is an irrelevance. I'm not saying it has no effect. I'm just saying I think a lot of the ways we talk about the effect it has is too unnuanced. I guess I would say.
Magic bullet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sarah, you've been very
I would say I could possibly argue against you that Lord of the Flies might be quite an accurate portrayal of what will happen to boys who've been brought up in the British public school system. But that is a debating point, and otherwise I absolutely agree with you about it. What I was going to say was what I would expect might well happen within climate change is a bit what happened about nuclear, or we will get the Armageddon scenarios as the background of all sorts of fiction, almost first. But there are quite a lot of books and television and stuff like that that are about environmental crimes